Origins of Progressive Movement, Progressive Political Science, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I gave sort of a social and briefly intellectual account of the context of the progressive movement, and I also talked about the way that I kind of divide up progressivism and liberalism in the United States history into three periods: kind of the progressive period from around 1880 to 1920, the New Deal era, predominantly the 1930s, and the Great Society era, which was sort of the mid 60s to mid 70s. So now in this lecture, I'm actually going to get to the reading, which is chapter 8, entitled Recent Tendencies, in Charles Merriam's book, History of American Political Theories. And in this lecture, I plan to talk about the progressive critique of the principles of the state of nature, social contract, natural equality, and natural liberty. In the third lecture, I'll talk about how the progressive critique of the founders' understanding of the purpose of government and the way that government should be structured, and then look at how the progressives thought that government should be structured. So, one of the things that's really nice about Merriam is that, especially in the early days with the progressive movement, progressive intellectuals were very straightforward in their disagreement with the founding principles. It wasn't that they were sort of anti-American founding, anti-American, or anything like that. It's just that they believed that the America's political institutions, embodied especially in the Constitution, were constructed according to a faulty political theory. Those institutions worked well enough at the time, so they obviously they didn't think they were a disaster or something, but the progressive intellectuals believed that, especially with industrialization and the transformation of the United States over the course of the 1800s, the limits and problems of the founders' political philosophy became more and more apparent. And for them especially, the fact that it created a government that was not capable of rationally and energetically guiding the growth of the American economy and the distribution of resources. So they thought the founders' government was just too limited. But as Merriam says at the beginning of his chapter, the progressive political science grows out of what he calls a revolution in both method and doctrine. As he says at the very beginning on page 179, in the last half of the 19th century, there appeared in the United States a group of political theorists differing from the earlier thinkers in respect to method and upon many important doctrines of political science. The new method was more systematic and scientific than that which preceded it, while the results reached showed a pronounced reaction from the individualistic philosophy of the early years of the century. And as he says about the change in method, so in other words, how you go about studying politics, this is the third paragraph. He says, the method of these authorities has already been indicated and need not be discussed at length. The significant fact about it is the change from the rather haphazard style of discussing political theory in earlier days to a more scientific way of approaching the questions of politics. A far more thorough knowledge of history and a broader comparative view of political institutions are conspicuous in the new system. So, in other words, they thought that older political philosophy, such as the political philosophy of the founding, was sort of armchair theorizing. It was, sort of just kind of, they thought, in an unsystematic way, looking at history, maybe looking at literature, maybe making things up some of the time, and sort of spinning a theory out of that. They didn't think it was rigorous enough. They didn't think it was sufficiently grounded in the facts of history, or take a broad enough view of the varieties of political institutions that exist. So these political scientists, these political theorists, the progressives, saw themselves as being much more scientific in the manner in which they studied politics. And it's not a coincidence that the American Political Science Association, the professional association that represents university professors of political science, was founded during this time by some of the people that Merriam mentions here. So this is a period of kind of the professionalization of political science. So the revolution method is basically more scientific, more historically accurate. Now, as for the changes in doctrines, so in other words, what they teach about the nature and purpose of government, as he says at the bottom of page 179, the doctrines of these men differ in many important respects from those earlier entertained. The individualistic ideas of the natural right school of political theory, endorsed in the Revolution, are discredited and repudiated. The notion that political society and government are based upon a contract between independent individuals and that such a contract is the sole source of political obligation is regarded as no longer tenable. And so then he goes on to talk about the objections to the social contract theory, objections to the notion of inalienable natural rights, objections to the notion of natural liberty, objections to the notion of natural equality, objections to the notion of the separation of powers, and so on. And we'll get to all of that. But so I wanted to sort of explain a little bit, though, what he means when he talks about the individualistic character of the founding principles. What he means is the conception that the purpose of government is to secure individual rights from harm, especially the right to property. So this idea that the primary purpose of government is to prevent harm. It's to prevent people from violating each other's individual natural rights. And that's what progressive intellectuals reject. And it's not that they think that government shouldn't prevent harm. It's they think that's a too narrow view of things, and that the government is there to promote a broader conception of the social good than merely the protection of individual rights. Because for them, the flip side of the protection of individual rights is the notion that the government doesn't do much other than prevent harm. So it leaves individuals up to their own devices to do what they want with their property and their wealth and all those kinds of things. And they think that society needs to be more actively guided by the government and not just left up to, basically the invisible hand, so to speak. So, and for a lot of progressives, kind of the what exemplifies the limited view of government embodied in the founding principles is the laissez-faire approach to economics. This, which you find, to a large extent in the late 1800s, that in the United States, by and large, the market is not significantly regulated by the government. So you have so to speak, a free market. And the progressives thought that on the whole, this actually was doing more harm than good, both because of the way that they believed it led to economic monopoly, it led to the worsening of the condition of the poor, the exploitation of the working poor, and it enabled the system where the wealthy few were able to dominate the government. And these are objections that in one form or another have existed in the United States for 150 years at least at this point. So this would be an example of what they saw as being wrong with the individualistic approach, that protection of individual right to private property, right to free exchange, means laissez-faire economics, means free market, which means basically the wealthy few getting most of the benefits of social cooperation. That was their thought. Now, as I just read, for Merriam, the first doctrine that he talks about the progressives as rejecting is the doctrine of the social contract. Just to read it again, the notion that political society and government are based upon a contract between independent individuals and that such a contract is the sole source of political obligation is regarded as no longer tenable. This is at the top of page 180 in your packet. And he goes on to say, for a lot of progressives, look, they rejected the notion that there ever was a state of nature, if by state of nature you mean a sort of primitive condition where human beings lived as independent individuals. Much like Calhoun's critique of Locke, which Merriam mentions, that this critique goes all the way back to Calhoun, they said, human beings are naturally social. We do not start out as individuals, so you do not need an artificial device such as a contract in order to bring people into society. We're naturally social. Now, of course, that's not quite an accurate depiction of what Locke means by the state of nature, but we can leave that aside for now. I think the fact that both Calhoun and the progressives can critique the notion of a state of nature as being a state of independent individuals, the fact that they delivered those critiques shows that even if that's not what Locke meant, probably a lot of Americans thought that way. That's what they thought the state of nature was. And insofar as they did, it's not true. It's not right. We are naturally social. Now, they also say there's another side of it that makes it sort of unhistorical, which is that if you take the account of the social contract as actually a kind of historical thesis about how government begins as a contract among previously independent individuals, that's totally unhistorical, because it presupposes that these is sort of, as they would think, primitive natural individuals were capable of conceiving of things such as the state, rule of law, the three powers of government, individual rights. There's this kind of idea that there are a number of actually rather sophisticated political ideas that only emerge rather late in human history. But if you take the social contract as the historical origin of politics, then you're supposing that these rather late ideas were actually already present in the minds of human beings way, way back at the beginning. That it sort of presupposes a degree of political experience and political enlightenment that people would not have had 10,000 years ago or whatever it was. So they thought that the social contract was also unhistorical in the way that it presupposes an amount of political knowledge that human beings would not have had in their early beginnings. So we are naturally social and therefore do not need a contract in order to construct society. And the kind of government that the social contract creates, according to people like Locke, is not something that primitive human beings could have conceived of. So they thought this just means the social contract is an inaccurate and a useless idea for thinking about government. As he says at the bottom of the first paragraph on page 180, as a matter of fact, the state may originate and has originated, Lieber said, in a variety of ways, as, for example, through force, fraud, consent, or religion. Right? So in other words, politics, governmental institutions, historically speaking, have emerged in lots of ways. Sometimes they might have emerged through a process of consent. Sometimes it might have come through conquest. Sometimes it might have come through the creation of a religious community that begins to assume political responsibilities. There are lots of different ways. And social contract really is not the most plausible one for the origins of government. As he goes on to say, the state is a product of a long social and political development process, right? So, and this is, again, you can see how this was present in Hegel, this notion that human experience, human knowledge of rights, of freedom, of government, these things have evolved culturally over time. And so to think of government as the product of a contract among naturally free individuals is incorrect. The state is something that has evolved over a long period of time. So now these all seem, fairly accurate criticisms if you take the social contract and the state of nature as intended to apply to actually existing historical conditions, I think for sure. But at any rate, that is the critique of the social contract, which, as you can tell, is also doubles as a critique of the state of nature. Much like with Hegel, the state of nature as solitary free individuals never existed, and therefore is not useful for thinking about politics. Social contract, no, that's not how things emerged, nor is it necessarily the way that government must emerge, and therefore it's not useful for thinking about politics. Now, along with that, they also reject the notion of natural rights. This he talks about at the bottom of page 180 and the top of page 181. Now, again, they're not denying that human beings have rights, that they have ethical obligations and those sorts of things, but they're specifically rejecting the founders' notion, or what they take to be the founders' notion, which is that by nature we have certain rights that we are aware of having and that we seek to assert or that we seek to protect. And then you give up some of those rights when you join society in order to have the protection of government. They don't believe that. Obviously, they had moral theories. They believed that people had rights and obligations, but they thought that the founders' theory of where those rights and obligations came from was incorrect. And again, this doesn't make them that much different from Hegel. Where the rejection of natural rights takes its most pointed form is in the rejection of natural liberty. Because remember, the old view, as Calhoun presented it, as was commonly understood, is that human beings are free by nature and give up part of that natural freedom when we join society. And the progressives, much like Calhoun, say, no, that's really not the case. In fact, there is no meaningful liberty outside of organized political society. And so therefore, you can't have a natural right to liberty because you're not naturally free. Freedom is something that's acquired. It's learned over time. As Hegel also argued, the state of nature, our earliest state, would not be a free state. We would not be rational. We would not have protection. In fact, you need to have the emergence of organized society with law, or at least with some form of government, in order for people to learn how to be free, how to act rationally in accordance with principles, in accordance with their own will, as opposed to just in accordance with their passions and things like that. So that's why, as Burgess says, and Burgess was a mentor of Theodore Roosevelt, there never was and there never can be any liberty upon this earth and among human beings outside of state organization. And so that could have been taken right from Hegel. And therefore, as he concludes later on, liberty is not a natural right which belongs to every human being without regard to the state or society under which he lives. Rather, the state is the source of individual liberty. Political organization makes liberty possible. So he talks about this on page 181. The state is the creator of liberty, the power that makes it possible. That's at the very bottom of page 181. And it's interesting here, he notes that Calhoun saw this already. You might remember from Calhoun's speech on the Oregon Bill that he said, the amount of freedom that a people is entitled to depends upon the degree of safety that they enjoy and also the degree of enlightenment and civilization that they have. That the more enlightened, the more civilized, the more experienced a people is with political institutions, the more freedom they can be entrusted with without it endangering the public good. And Merriam notes, he says, Calhoun had already seen this fact about liberty, that it's something that has to be acquired by degrees over time. But the problem, he says, is that Calhoun's critique of natural liberty didn't really catch on because he used it as part of his arguments for justifying slavery. And so the general critique of Locke got discredited because he used it in the service of a discreditable aim, namely the preservation of slavery. Now that this is now several decades after the Civil War, they're saying we can see the merits of Calhoun's critique of the notion of natural liberty, and also, as he claims, they do not associate it with any defense of slavery. So even though they believe that it's not the case that everybody is entitled to an equal amount of liberty, nonetheless, they are not defenders of slavery. But this rejection of natural liberty, it does serve as a segue to a rejection of natural equality, which he talks about on page 182, where he says, liberty, moreover, is not a right equally enjoyed by all. It is dependent on the degree of civilization reached by the given people. That's the top of page 182, right? And increases as this advances. The idea that liberty is a natural right is abandoned, and the inseparable connection between political liberty and political capacity is strongly emphasized. And in that, they're really, again, not that different from Calhoun. The idea is there is not some uniform amount of liberty that every human being is entitled to simply by virtue of being human. No, rather, the amount of liberty a people is entitled to depends upon their capacity to use it well in accordance with public order. And that varies over time. And in the passages after that, you can see how for progressives, this got mixed with their racial views, because the early a lot of people in the progressive movement were, staunch racists. They believed in the kind of the cultural, but also the kind of biological or racial superiority of Northern Europeans. And this is something that exists in the progressive movement really up through the 30s. The Nazis clearly discredit this whole sort of racialist, eugenic way of thinking about things. But it's important to know that the American progressive movement had a eugenics component. There was a lot of racism in it, which made it not that different from much of American society at the time. And so for Merriam, and I won't read the passages on page 182, but he draws some kind of hair-raising conclusions from this, which is that insofar as Northern Europeans seem to be endowed with superior political wisdom and character, it therefore is the duty of Northern Europeans to civilize the rest of the globe. But also this entails such things as that in a mixed race society such as the United States, it is really the Northern Europeans who should hold the balance of political power. So in other words, Charles Merriam is saying that something like Jim Crow is actually justified. A lot of progressives were proponents of things like IQ tests for voting. So they were fine with disenfranchising individuals or even entire races that they believed were inferior to white Northern Europeans. They were also oftentimes enthusiastic supporters of colonialism, of the idea that, well, we should go out and conquer less civilized people in order to civilize them, in order to teach them how to be free. And as he says, if there are some peoples who prove to be too barbaric to become civilized, then it is legitimate to just wipe them out. So these are obviously not opinions you would come across in modern progressivism, but they were there in the early progressive movement, and you can see how it is sort of intimately tied to their rejection of the founding principles. They reject natural liberty, they reject natural equality. So that's it for that. In the next lecture, I will talk about the progressive understanding of the purpose of government and how government should be restructured in order to serve that purpose.